You know, I've always loved fishing crankbaits for walleyes in the weeds. It seems kind of counterproductive with all those open hooks, but it's something that I have loved to do. You know, the first walleye, one of the first walleyes that I caught on purpose, actually walleye fishing, was actually caught on a crankbait, a floating Rapala number 11, gold with a orange belly, on purpose, fishing shallow flats, Lake Nipissing here in Lapeer, casting in right around Father's Day, mid-June. It was actually June 18th. I had my wife with me. She was swatting mosquitoes and not very happy. I had my brother. He wanted to get home because it was getting dark. And just in that perfect twilight time where the sun has gone down at night, but it's still light, it's not dark yet, I hooked into a 26-inch walleye in about 6 feet of water over shallow water weeds, and I was hooked. Ever since then, I've looked for weed beds on purpose to fish both on big bodies of water like the Great Lakes and small inland lakes. I think walleyes love the weeds, and crankbaits is a great way to get them out of there. You know, we've known forever that walleyes live in the weeds. Our grandpa used to tell us you had to get up early to go catch walleye, and that's because there is a concentration, a quick little bite window in the morning in shallow water if you don't understand what's actually happening. If you don't understand and pay attention to what we're going to teach you right here, you're going to know why and how you can catch walleyes on crankbaits in the weeds all day long, all season long as the weeds are green. So let's get started talking about catching weed walleye on crankbaits. Okay, so why do walleyes love crankbaits when they're living in the weeds? And why do crankbaits work so well when we're fishing for walleyes in the weeds? Well, one simple answer to me sticks out, and that is because they imitate the bait that walleyes are eating. Now, when walleyes are in the weeds, most of the food that they're feeding on is bait. It's minnows, it's small shiners, it's young of the year perch, it may be some small suckers, it may be some other type of bait fish, maybe young of the year walleye, young of the year bass. But it's almost always meat, if you will. They do eat bugs, walleyes do like to eat mayflies, but when they're in the weeds, they're in there looking for bait. They're in there looking for meat. They're in there looking for a steak. They're looking for a manly meal, and nothing imitates live bait, minnows, better than a crankbait does. And that's one of the reasons that crankbaits work so well for walleye in the weeds. But again, picking the right size, picking the right shape is all part of that. But crankbaits work great in the weeds because they imitate the bait that walleyes are chasing when they're living in the weeds. Okay, all right, let's move on to the shapes we want to have when we're picking our crankbaits for walleye fishing in the weeds. Picking the right shape is a very, very important first step in stocking your tackle box. Unlike trolling for walleye in open water where your crankbait selection can be huge, sometimes actually overwhelming and unmanageable, if you will, crankbait selection for walleye in the weeds is pretty simple. We're going to start with two basic shapes that you need to have that catch a lot of walleyes when you're fishing in the weeds. First one is a long, skinny, what we call a stick bait, a minnow bait, right? Remember, a minnow bait is long and skinny. It has a roll, very little side-to-side tail wiggle, and it rolls side to side. That's that long, skinny shape. The next shape we want to have is we want to make sure we have what we call a shad bait. A little bit shorter bait, a little bit fatter bait, a little bit thicker bait top to bottom. It has a little bit of the roll, the side-to-side roll that a stick bait has, but it has more side-to-side wiggle. Those two basic shapes, a long and skinny shape and a short and fat shad shape, minnow baits, shad baits, those are the two shapes that you want to concentrate on when you're putting together a tackle box, getting ready to stock that for catching weed walleye on crankbaits. Stick with those two shapes, you're going to be just fine. Well, now that we've got a shape figured out, we know what two shapes we have to have. How big or what size of lure should I put in my tackle box to tackle walleye in the weeds if I want to catch them on crankbaits? Well, that's a great question. And the answer is you want a lot of different sizes. We're going to talk about colors in a minute, so you don't have to buy a whole bunch of baits, but two shapes, and we're going to talk about multiple sizes. So the smallest size that I fish a lot in the weeds, we're going to stick with Rapalas here. This is a size 7. So remember, that 7 is the number of centimeters. So 2.5 centimeters per inch. So that bait is just under 3 inches long. That is a number 7, and that's about as small as I would go. And I go all the way up to a number 18. That's right, a number 18. This is a big Rapala, but it's a great weed walleye bait all year long, but specifically in the spring and the fall, and specifically in low light conditions. It catches a lot of fish. But from size 7, you can see the size 7 on the bottom, size 18 on the top, with a big emphasis on lures in the size 9 range, size 11, and size 13 range. So that 9, 11, and 13 are going to be kind of the bulk of your baits, but make sure you've got some 18s or some longer baits up to about 6 inches long, and make sure you've got some smaller baits down around 2.5, 3 inches long. If you stock your tackle box that way with those size baits, you're going to have the right bait for the conditions you're faced with. Remember, not only do we want to have those different sizes in minnow baits, we also want to make sure we have those different sizes in shad baits. So we want to make sure we've got multiple sizes, size 5s, size 7s. We want to make sure we've got different sizes in both our shad baits and our stick baits or minnow baits, all the way from about 2.5 inches all the way up to about 6 inches, with an emphasis on that 4 and 5 inch range. That's going to catch you a lot of fish when you're fishing for weed walleye with crankbaits. That's a great start to getting your tackle box stocked with the right size baits to be effective every day. Okay, so before we move on to weed crankbait colors, I want to talk about the difference between wood and plastic baits and why it's important that you have both in your tackle box. So here I have, let's go to a stick bait. So here I have a Husky Jerk. This could also be a Deep Junior Thunder Stick. And then here I have a Balsa number 11. So these are both number 11s. This is a number 11 Husky Jerk, number 11 traditional or floating Rapala. Both the same shape, both the same size. You can see that. They have basically the same action, but the plastic baits have a tendency to have a few rattles inside, and the difference is plastic baits have a tendency to dive a little bit deeper and stay there on the pause. Because they're not quite as buoyant as balsa baits, if you reel down on top of the weeds and stop, this plastic bait has a tendency to stay there for a second and kind of rise backwards, whereas a balsa bait has a tendency to go down, rise quicker, and rise straight up. Now, both of those presentations can be really, really effective depending on the day. But even in your shad style baits, you want to make sure you've got plastic. You want to make sure you've got balsa. In your stick baits, you want to make sure you've got plastic. You want to make sure you've got balsa in all of the size ranges, because that is going to make sure that you have the right bait, the right presentation, with just these little tweaks. The differences between the way plastic baits move through the water, the way they sound, and the way they rise on a pause is different than the way balsa baits do that. Each day, you're going to have to make that decision on which is going to be better, wood or plastic. Make sure you stock your tackle box with both of those. You'll catch a lot more fish having that option of wood or plastic baits. Okay, so let's get to one of my least favorite topics to talk about because it is so diverse, and that is lure color. Now, I have two thoughts about lure color in the weeds. If the weeds are fairly thick, if they're sparse, if it's low light conditions, or if you're fishing in the weeds, you're fishing over the tops of the weeds, I'm going to call them unnatural bright colors. I love Fire Tiger. I love Clown, Chartreuse, Silver, Big Red Nose. I love that. I love solid color baits, maybe solid oranges, maybe gold. Let's see if I got one here. Maybe gold with an orange belly. Here we go. Got an orange with a gold belly. I like baits that necessarily aren't natural. They don't look like anything that is swimming, because remember, baits are colored, or bait fish are colored the way they're colored in nature to disappear from fish, to hide in the weeds. And if you're fishing thick weeds, you're fishing on the tops of the weeds, you want to make sure that you've got a bait that fish can see. I like really, really, really bright colors. Now, conversely, if I'm fishing the outside edge of the weed bed, or I'm out closer to open water, or the weeds aren't quite up yet in the spring, they're just kind of starting to sprout, I like to go with natural colors. Silver and blue with an orange belly, one of my favorites. I like to go with natural perch, especially if it has a bright orange belly, one of my favorites, a natural perch. The natural bluegill is another one that I like to fish. The natural walleye is another color that I like to fish. If I'm fishing in weed beds that aren't very thick, they're just sparse, they're just coming out, or if I'm fishing on the outside edge of weeds, I'll go more natural with my colors. If I'm fishing on the tops of the weeds or the weeds are fairly thick, I'll go less natural, make sure I've got a lot of orange. Orange is one of my key colors, orange and gold. I will concentrate on those colors if I'm fishing thick weeds on the tops of the weeds, natural colors on the outside edge or in sparse weeds. That's going to help you catch more fish by picking those colors. Now, I do carry natural bluegill. I do carry natural perch. I do carry natural walleye. I carry all of those colors in my boxes just because, again, sometimes in those sparse conditions, those colors have a tendency to be really, really, really good. I think I've got a natural bluegill in here. But as the water gets a little bit thicker, there we go, there's a natural bluegill right there. So that's a natural bluegill, which is like a bluegill. Okay, but notice it has the orange. That's why I like a lot of orange. Perch have orange. Bluegills have orange. That's why I like blue and silver with an orange belly. Gold with an orange belly. Natural perch, natural bluegill, all have orange. So again, one more time, I run this down. Unnatural, bright, flashy colors with an emphasis on orange. If I am fishing in heavy weeds or the tops of the weeds, once the weeds get a little sparse in spring or start to die in the fall, or I'm fishing the outside edge of the weeds, I don't mind going with the natural colors because now the fish can see those out in that open water and they can actually key on them and actually bite them. You take those natural colors, put them in the weeds, they're kind of hard to see. So there's a little idea on how to pick colors for your crankbaits and make sure you're fishing the right one based on what part of the weed bed you're fishing, and I promise you it's going to help you catch more fish. Okay, let's do a real quick rundown of some of my favorite baits that I fish when I fish inside the weeds or fish walleye in the weeds on crankbait. So let's start with the original floating Rapala. I think everybody has ever had these in their box, right? Let's start with this. I carry this in size 7, size 9, size 11, size 13, size 18, and they make a Husky 13, which has a little bit thicker top. So this is a Husky 13 right here, a little bit wider tip, not a Husky jerk, it's a Husky, a floating 13 Husky, and then there's the regular. You can see the difference. So I carry 7s, 9s, 11s, 13s, Husky 13s, and 18s with an emphasis on the 9s, 11s, and 13s. Those are my favorites. All right, plastic stick baits. I like Junior Thunder Sticks. Those are some of my favorites, and I like Rapala Husky Jerks. Again, 7, 9, 11, maybe even into 13 are my favorites. Let's go to shad baits. A couple shad baits I like. Shallow Shad Rapala number 5, number 7, number 9. Deep shad. So here's a shallow shad rap. You can see the little L shape or stair step lip. It runs very shallow. One of my favorite baits to fish in the weeds. And then we go to a deep shad rap with a longer lip for fishing the outside edge of the weeds over top of deeper weeds. Again, I like those in size 5, 7, and 9. Those are some of my favorites. A couple of different baits when we talk about going to plastic. A couple of my favorites. Glass shad rap. So the same as a shad rap, just has the same body, has a rattle, a really good rattle in it, and it's made out of plastic and you can actually see through it. The bodies are actually clear. That's why they call them glass shad raps. One of my favorites for fishing in the weeds. Again, size 5, size 7, size 9 with an emphasis on 5 and 7 in both shallow and deep. And then there is a rattling shad rap, which is a solid plastic body with a rattle inside. And I fish these mostly in size 7. Very few size 5s in these. I have a tendency to really like the size 7 in these. New recently, which we troll on Saginaw Bay, Lake Erie, flicker shads. Make sure you got a good selection of size 5 and size 7. Flicker shads, great options for plastic shad baits. Now, one other thing I want to mention to you when we're talking about weed walleye, there's 2 baits I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about original floating jointed Rapala. This happens to be a number 9. I like J9s, J11s are my favorites. I do carry some J13s, but 9s and 11s are my favorites. This jointed bait in shallow water, especially if you want to fish really slow, gives it a little more action and makes it look more like an injured bait fish than a solid bait does. So make sure you've got some J9s, J11s, and a few J13s in your box, but emphasis on that 9 and 11 jointed. And then another bait that I would not fish the weeds without, and I love to fish walleye in the weeds, guys. It's one of my favorite ways to catch them. This is a jointed Shad Rap. So it's a jointed Shad Rap. It's two-piece. This is actually a rattling Shad Rap. This is the plastic version, and it has that joint. I love these baits. I fish a lot. I would tell you about 50% of the crankbaits that I throw in weeds are jointed. Be it a regular floating Rapala jointed or the jointed Shad Rap. I like jointed baits, so make sure you've got a few of those in your box. That right there is a little tip on how to get started. Sounds like a lot, but it's not that many baits. It's a couple baits, but it's more a difference in material and then in sizes, and just stick to those colors, right? Silver blue with an orange belly, natural perch, natural bluegill, gold with an orange belly, and then fire tiger. And you've got everything you need to catch walleyes in the weeds any place that they swim. Okay? All right, so there is a quick rundown of some of the baits that I like and how I stack or stock my tackle box, the lures that I like and lures that I know will catch you fish when you're fishing for walleyes in the weeds. Well, obviously, all these crankbaits that we have now, these couple boxes of crankbaits, we've got to get them out to the fish somehow. So how do we do that? Let's talk about the rods and reels. First of all, for me, these types of crankbaits, this is a spinning rod application. They're really not heavy enough to handle on a bait caster. This is definitely a spinning rod application. Now, you're going to be casting some bigger baits. The size 9 deep diving Shad Raps are fairly heavy bait. They pull pretty good. So you're going to want a fairly thick line. I like a good quality spinning reel, and I like to use about 10 or 12 pound castable fluorocarbon. Make sure you've got a nice soft fluorocarbon. Make sure that you've got one that you can cast a long way and isn't going to curl up on you. That's the one that you want to pick. No matter what company you use, make sure you pick a castable fluorocarbon. I'm going to attach my crankbaits with a crankbait snap, just a crankbait snap, not a swivel, and that makes it really easy to change baits and kind of change sizes and change colors fairly quickly. Just that regular small crankbait snap we use on all of our crankbaits. Now, let's talk about the rod. Good quality graphite. You want a stiff backbone. And I've got this loaded so you can kind of put it in front of the map there where you can see the bend. I want about 1/3 of the rod to bend. So this rod is 6.5 foot long. I like 6.5, 6'9", but I want about the top 2 feet of that rod, 18 inches of that rod to bend. I want a little bit of give. That helps me get a little bit of action on my bait, and it lets me when I'm fishing baits in the weeds, I want them to get hung up. Now that may sound like, oh, I don't want them to get hung up. Yes, you do. I want them to get hung up. If I'm fishing too stiff of a rod, they won't get hung up. Too soft of a rod, I can't pull them off. So I like my baits to get hung up on the weeds a little bit, especially if I get lucky and get them on the back hook, especially on green cabbages. It's very strong. Because then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reel down. I'm going to let that soft tip kind of reel down, and I'm going to pull back really quick and jerk that bait off the weeds. So what happens, that bait is stuck on the weeds. You pull it forward, it comes forward real quick. Remember, these baits float. It comes forward real quick. You can't reel fast enough to keep up, and that bait floats up to the top, and a lot of times you'll trigger a strike. So I like that little bit of soft tip so I can let that bait kind of dig into the weeds a little bit, get caught, and then I want a lot of backbone. This is a medium heavy rod with a moderate action. That's what we're looking for. So we want medium heavy power, medium to medium heavy power with a moderate or a soft tip. That's important. Too soft, you can't pull the crankbaits off the weeds. Too stiff, you're never going to get hung up because the rod's going to pull them off. That's a perfect combination. 6'6", 6'9", medium to medium heavy power with a moderate tip is going to be a perfect selection for you to cast crankbaits, both the shallow water, smaller crankbaits, and the deeper diving, a little bit heavier crankbaits. A great combination to fish with, teamed up with a good 10 or 12 pound test castable fluorocarbon. You've got a great combination for catching walleye in the weeds, casting crankbaits, which is a fun way to catch them. Okay, so there's everything you need to know to get started catching weed walleye on crankbaits. Remember, we talked about why walleye like crankbaits in the weeds. We talked about picking the right crankbait size, the right crankbait shape. We talked about the difference in color. We talked about how important it was to have both wood and plastic crankbaits. I gave you some of my favorite crankbaits for fishing the weeds, and we wrapped it up talking about the right rod, reel, and line combinations to get you started. Grab some of that information, get yourself the right rod, reel, and line combination. I'm sure you've got it in your garage. Just spool it up with some 10 or 12 pound fluorocarbon. You're ready to go. Grab a few baits, a few stick baits, a few shad baits, both in shallow and deep diving, in both wood and plastic. Stick to the colors we talked about. Get out there, find a weed bed, start casting. I promise you're going to be surprised at both the quantity and, more importantly, the quality of walleye you can catch in the weeds anytime they're green, all season long, all day long. Thanks for joining us here at Teaching Fishing. I'm Captain Lance Valentine. Can't wait to see you back here next time.